All right. Okay, I gotta hit this. Got it. All right. Castiglione is the Book of the Courtier, is a very famous Renaissance text. And it's the product of a man of the world, a practical man. It is not primarily a theoretical book. And it has much in common with Machiavelli. And both Machiavelli and Castiglione, and for that matter, Thomas More, are roughly speaking contemporaries. And they all, the three of them look at the world in a very different way, but it's hard to fully understand Castiglione until you read through the book. Now, the Book of the Courtier is intended to describe for an ambitious young man of good education and good birth how to step up in the political life of the world, how to find a position at a court, and how to become an important advisor to a ruler, and how to conduct yourself while trying to do that. Now, Castiglione, for those of you that are interested in learning how to handle yourself practically, it's actually a wonderful book like that. If you're ever in a position where you end up working at the White House or in the capital city of whatever country you're living in, and you've been brought up into important political ranks, Castiglione will give you a very good idea of how to handle yourself, both 500 years ago and also today. A good courtier must look good and present himself well. He must speak well, and he must be a multi-talented individual, a genuine Renaissance man. He is educated. He knows the classics, but he also knows contemporary literature and thought. And Castiglione himself was an amazing individual. He's somewhat kind of halfway between James Bond and Henry Kissinger, in the sense that he was a combination of a deeply learned individual, but someone that was predisposed towards a life of action. And if you ever get a chance to see the portrait that was painted of him, you'll see immediately what Castiglione wants to reveal of himself. He's a man expensively dressed, but with no bling. He's not a clown, and he's not trying to attract improper attention to himself. Instead, he's very expensively dressed, but it's all understated in blacks and browns. What that means is, if you're going to be moving in political circles, you have to dress and look appropriately to the job you're doing. All right. There are few jobs in which appearance is more important than political life. So the Castiglione is trying to teach an ambitious young man how to take his place in political society. And for a long time, this has been a very popular book. I read a book about Castiglione's book, The Book of the Courtier, and all the interpretations of it that have been proposed in the intervening 500 years since it was published. And I must confess, my reading was not among them. So let me warn you in advance that this is a very peculiar reading. It's a Machiavellian reading, but it's also a reading after the fashion of Leo Strauss. He was a 20th century political philosopher who was often looking for hidden meanings in texts, left only for those that are able to decode them. Now, sometimes he goes a little bit too far and attributes hidden meanings where I can't actually see them. On the other hand, every once in a while, he's right. There is a text under the text. And that's what's true about Castiglione. I've been reading this book for about 35 years, I guess. And in the first 15 or 20 years, I didn't notice anything particularly unusual about it. It seemed like an interesting second-tier text from the Renaissance. In other words, in order to know Renaissance writing and thought, it's the kind of book that a pro like me would read, but I'm not so sure that I would necessarily choose it for most beginners. On the other hand, I taught it in a class about 15 years ago. And at the end of the class, a young woman came up to me and asked me a question that I didn't know the answer to. And before, I was tempted to just try and make up an answer on the fly, but then I stopped myself, because one of the things that I try and teach my students, you can ask any of them, is that I have a very happy memory of the way in which the great Rabbi Maimonides used to teach his students. He used to tell his students, train thy tongue to say, I do not know. It is a very hard thing for learned people to do. It is even harder for half-learned people to do. So if you are a student, may I suggest, for your own benefit, that you train thy tongue to say, I do not know. So I stopped myself giving a flip answer, and I said to her, I don't know. I've never actually thought about that before. And so then I went back and I looked at it, and it took me a very long time to break the code, but I think that there's a hidden text under this text, and that what this young woman had done is alert me to it. Now, the idea of a text under a text, or in visual art, a painting under a painting, or a painting within a painting, was not unusual in Renaissance literature or in Renaissance art. One of my friends who specializes in Italian history once said that in the Italian Renaissance, nothing is what it seems. And there's a lot of truth in that. What I'm going to try and argue for in the case of Castiglione is that this subtext is very different from the text we think we're reading. And in some ways, the explanation for why Machiavelli is as paranoid and cynical as he is because he's surrounded with people like Castiglione. Castiglione, in my view, in this new reading, is far more Machiavellian than Machiavelli could ever hope to be. This is a brilliant work. It's a kind of autobiography, but it's also a kind of picaresque novel, which is a strange thing to find underneath an etiquette book. And in addition to that, it's also about sexual politics. If you remember Machiavelli's play, The Mandragola, where he showed the importance of virtù, and we could see the distinction between virtù and virtue. Well, here we're going to see somewhat of the same thing. We're going to see who Castiglione really is behind the facade that he creates for himself. So we're going to find a man very different from the way he presents himself. And for those of you at home who are reading this, I have a copy of the Penguin edition, and I'm going to be picking out sections from this. So if you have the Penguin edition, you'll be able to go to the pages I'm talking about and figure out what's going on. Now, much of what's in the courtier on the surface level is stolen. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no literate writer that fails to be influenced by his predecessors. And in the case of Castiglione, there's much that's lifted from Plato's Symposium, which is a dialogue about love. And that's going to be one of the key things, courtly love in the book, how the courtier conducts himself in love. And in addition, we're also going to see that Ovid's The Art of Love is the crucial text in understanding this book. Ovid's Art of Love, it's a wonderful piece by one of Rome's great poets, also one of Rome's great seducers. It's a how-to manual for seduction, how to fall in love and also how to get out of love when you find it troublesome. So if you understand that Castiglione knows these books very well, but never tips his hand or is very reluctant to tip his hand, you'll understand how subtle and intelligent Castiglione is. Now, he gives us one of the great ideas in Renaissance thought, and that's spezzatura. Spezzatura might be translated into current vernacular English as being cool. In other words, in order to have spezzatura, you have to look cool, you have to look perfectly composed, perfectly well-dressed, and you're going to pretend that this is easy and natural. In fact, what Castiglione does is spend hours preparing how he looks and days preparing the things he's going to say. And then he casts them off as if they're things that just happen to pop into his head. In other words, he's pretending to be nonchalant about things he works very, very hard at. If you've ever known someone getting dressed for a big event, and if such a lady were to ask you, how do I look? The answer is, you look wonderful. Later on, she may well claim that, oh, this is just something I threw on. She is practicing spezzatura. She is making what is difficult seem easy. And this studied nonchalance is a kind of oxymoron. It's a combination of opposites, because nonchalance is the opposite of being studied and working very hard. But he's mastered that. And if you look at his portrait, there's only one of him, you'll see a master of spezzatura. He is a dignified man in middle age, not so young as to be untested and unseasoned, but not so old as to be feeble and frail. He's in the middle of life. He's a vigorous man. And the expression on his face is almost impossible to read. In some ways, it's like that smile on the Mona Lisa, except that he's not really smiling. He's sitting there as if he were a poker player, waiting for you to decide whether you're going to call or fold. He's not giving anything away. He has a great poker face in a society that doesn't have poker. So here's the argument I want to make about Castiglione. He was an extraordinary figure, both as a thinker and as a man of action. He was so renowned for his abilities and due in no part to spezzatura, that he was eventually chosen by the Pope to be the papal nuncio to Spain. Now, you have to understand the politics of Italy in the 1520s. Spain has suddenly come to dominate European politics. And the reason why is that they are being fed an ocean of money that they don't have to work for, that they can just pick up and take over to the New World. And what that means is that Spain can buy mercenaries, it can buy arms, it can buy ships, and it can buy, therefore, political power. So Spain is a rampant political force in Europe, and the Pope is naturally quite worried about the growing power of Spain, because you've got to remember, the papacy is not just a religious office, it's also a highly political office. And so the Pope, because he's the head of the Catholic Church, can choose anyone from pre-Reformation Europe to come and work for him. In other words, it's a little bit like being invited to dinner at the White House. It's improper to say no. In Castiglione's time, if the Pope calls you to Rome and he wants you to do something or take some office for him, there's really no way to say no. It's an enormous honor, but it's also an enormous burden. What Castiglione, the job he was given, was papal nuncio to Spain. In other words, he's the papal ambassador to Spain. And this is the most treacherous political minefield in Europe at the time. In other words, this is the #1 diplomatic post in Europe at the time. And the Pope could choose anybody he wanted, and he chose Castiglione for a reason. The guy gets the job done. He has a well-earned reputation for being a man of action, also a man of prudence and judgment and deep thought. So he's drawn away from his position at the court of Urbino, and he takes a job with the Pope and moves to Spain. He represents the papal interests at the Spanish court. And eventually, he takes holy orders, becomes a Catholic priest, and because he's such a talented individual, ends up very quickly becoming a bishop. So he's the Bishop of Avila 10 years after he leaves the court of Urbino. And the courtier is written as a kind of dialogue over 4 days in which Castiglione himself is absent. He says he was on a diplomatic mission to England at the time. So this is something that he's making up out of whole cloth. And he's doing his best to separate himself from the discussions that go on over these 4 evenings. All right. So he's a man of action and a man of contemplation. He's a universal man in the Renaissance sense. And he ended up being a priest and then a bishop, but he also wrote this book, which made him famous. Now, it's very interesting that he spent about 10 years writing and rewriting this book and editing it, showing it to his intellectual friends. So every word in this, while it may seem slapdash, is the work of elaborate spezzatura. And every word is there for a reason. And what seems not to make sense, in fact, is gesturing at a different kind of sense. So let me see if I can explain to you what I think is going on here, apart from a very useful book of etiquette if you're going to be in high political circles, both then and now. What I think is going on here is a memoir about sexual politics. And in that sense, he would be similar to Machiavelli when he was writing The Prince, but also similar to Machiavelli when he was writing Mandragola, because sex and politics, irrational desires and their rational organization, the rational attempt to get what is dubiously legitimate, is what both Machiavelli and, surprisingly, Castiglione are both interested in. All right. Now, at the beginning of the book, we find out we're going to meet all the players, and they're all figures at the court of Urbino, both male and female, and they spend their evenings in something like Platonic discussion. The Duke of Urbino, the husband of the Duchess, is unfortunately an elderly man. He's chronically sick, and so he's an invalid. So he comes down during the daytime, very briefly, generally speaking, but he's not in the dialogue. This is what went on in the evening when the Duke, regrettably, was upstairs in bed. So everyone is sitting around a beautifully appointed room, and they're discussing things like courtesy, in the strict sense of how to be a courtier, how to behave yourself when you're in positions of power or near positions of power. And it's also about love. And it's also about spezzatura and how to hide what you're doing from the prying eyes of people that you don't want it to be revealed to. So in the beginning of the book, we meet the players. The first is the Duchess of Urbino. And on page 32, he said, "The book itself is paying what I owe to the memory of so great a lady." And she was the center of the discussion. She was at the head of the table because her husband was upstairs in bed. He's a chronic invalid. And on page 41, Castiglione, quite properly, praises the Duke as an excellent man, but says, regrettably, now he's sick and an invalid, which means that we are all impoverished because we can't get the insights that the Duke used to bestow upon us so freely. On the other hand, then 2 pages later, on 43, he says, all of us were supremely happy whenever we came into the presence of the Duchess. And then on 46, the topic of love is introduced, and it turns out, although it may not be apparent on a first reading, love is the main theme of the book. All right. Now, here's what my young student asked me that made me reevaluate what I saw in the book. On page 48, there is what is called in the text a stupid joke. Now, first question would be, if the joke is stupid, why did you leave it in? In other words, if you're writing and rewriting a text very carefully over a period of more than 10 years, why would you include a joke that was stupid? This would seem to be the opposite of spezzatura. And even more perplexing, we never find out what the punchline is to the stupid joke. So I had just slipped by it, thinking it wasn't important, but this can be a very bad mistake when you're reading important texts, particularly those that involve a careful and extended period of writing. So careful writing deserves careful reading. And I must confess, for a long time, I hadn't done that. One of my students, and those of you who are teachers in the audience will find out you learn more from your students than from anybody else. One of my students asked me a question and I didn't have the answer. So I said, I do not know. And then I went back and looked at it. So here's the joke, and see if you can figure it out, and see if you can figure out why anybody would want such a stupid thing in their book. Page 48, it's one of the gentlemen in the discussion says, almost all women hate rats and love snakes. Now, I myself have 3 daughters, and at the time, I asked each of them, how do you feel about rats and snakes? And for all 3 of them, they told me that they like neither of them, that rats are filthy and snakes are creepy, and they didn't like them at all. But this joker insists that women hate rats, but love snakes. And I was thinking back into the paintings of the Italian Renaissance, and I couldn't think of any in which feature a snake, since after all, it's the symbol of seduction and the symbol of evil from the biblical Garden of Eden. Other things, lapdogs and stuff, I'm familiar with such paintings, but I don't know of any in which rats are banished, but snakes are upheld. So my question is, what is this doing here? Why are we having this stupid joke thrown at us? And why do we not find out what the punchline is so we can decide whether it's stupid or not? Well, none of those questions get answered. And Castiglione is too smart and too careful and too great a master of spezzatura to let on. So when I read the book, I forget who wrote it, but there's a book about the 500 years of interpretation of this book. No one has proposed the interpretation that I'm about to propose. And here it is. Castiglione has seduced the Duchess of Urbino. And because the Duchess of Urbino, her husband is dead while he's at the court, and her son is the regent, she controls her son. And once he seduces the Duchess, he's in control of the Duchess. So what this is not just a book of etiquette. It's a disguised story of his life at court in which he became the de facto Duke of Urbino without firing a shot. In other words, Machiavelli tells us that it's important for a prince to be both a lion and a fox. Well, unless you have an army at your disposal, there's no way to become a lion. But if you use your head, it is certainly possible to become a fox. And Castiglione is one of the great foxes of Renaissance literature. Now, page 51, we start with the ideal courtier. In other words, this is going to be the Platonic form of the perfect participant in court life. And on 66 and 67, he's going to introduce the idea of spezzatura. And this is well worth thinking about, because both then and now, the Italians are a very stylish people. They do beautiful work when it comes to, say, things like designing clothing. Italian design is wonderful. And there's also a sense of spezzatura as being a virtue, as being able to pull off something very complicated, but making it look as though it's very simple. Now, on page 177, Castiglione goes a little further, and he talks about jokes, and he says, a very sophisticated joke relies on a certain amount of dissimulation. So it could be that this book contains a very sophisticated kind of joke. And the dissimulation may have been to say that the joke was stupid and suggest that there was no punchline to it. And that, I think, is exactly what Castiglione has done. All right. First things first, page 116. Prudence is foremost. He doesn't want to get caught, and he doesn't want his beloved, because he has fallen in love with the Duchess, doesn't want her to get caught either. And a woman's status as being chaste is hugely important in the Italian Renaissance and in Europe in earlier times. So the key thing is you have to protect the reputation of the woman you've seduced. So page 116, he says, Our courtier will pay attention to the occupation of those with whom he is speaking, and he will behave accordingly. And he will speak in one way with men and another with women. And if he should want to suggest something to his own credit, he will do so with dissimulation, as if purely by chance and in passing, spezzatura, and with the discretion and caution that Count Ludovico explained to us yesterday. Castiglione can't help himself. He's telling us how to read his book. Like Plato's Republic, this is a book that explains to the careful reader how it's supposed to be read. Now, page 120, Castiglione notes that you dissimulate when you are playing a part in the political play at court. In other words, court life is a kind of living theater. And he says, I wish him to dissimulate the care and effort that are necessary for any competent performance. Spezzatura, once again. This book itself is one of the great achievements in spezzatura because it actually actively tells you what it's about, but it does so in a hidden, secret way, accessible only to those that are asking the right questions. All right. Now, one of the most fascinating things about this book is reflexivity. And reflexivity is a fascinating logical capacity in which you turn the assumptions and the presuppositions of a way of thinking back on itself, right? Socrates does this many times in the dialogues. He's a master of reflexivity. But what Castiglione gives here on page 78 is one of the most fascinating things I've ever seen constructed. It's a very complicated rhetorical construction. It is a simile about metaphors. So it's pretty complicated. We're two levels removed from action towards speech and then a speech above the speech. Here's what he says in a simile about metaphors. This is about the courtier. Sometimes I would like him to use certain words in a metaphorical sense, putting them to novel use, like a gardener grafting a branch onto a healthier trunk, and so increasing their attractiveness and beauty, so that what is said or written makes us seem to experience things at first hand and greatly increases our enjoyment. Now, this arboreal simile, where he says that a courtier is like an intelligent gardener who cuts a strong branch off an old, weak, gnarled tree and replaces it onto a healthier trunk where it will grow and flourish a great deal more. Well, you see, that's the thing. He just said that he wants metaphors and similes used in such a way so that you don't immediately get a sense of what they're about. But think about this simile about metaphors. He could be talking about grafting fruit trees, or perhaps he's talking about grafting palm trees or evergreen trees or deciduous trees. It's quite ambiguous. But it's also possible that he's talking about family trees. And that's what the metaphor really means. It's hidden there, and he has what the CIA calls plausible deniability. Everything in this book can be read at the surface level. He says, look, I'm talking about trees. What do you want me to do? But if you are following and not being gulled by the spezzatura here, what you will find out is that he is proposing to remove a branch, a healthy branch, a lovely branch, from an old tree that's weak and in disrepair, and graft it onto a new and better trunk. And it's left to your imagination to figure out what he might be talking about. Now, what he says is that it is necessary for us to use spezzatura, but keep your eyes open because writing is subtle, all right? He says on 66 and 7, true art is what does not seem to be art. And the most important thing is to conceal it, because if it is revealed, it discredits a man completely and ruins his reputation. Oh, this is beautiful. I mean, he is a piece of work. He is an expert seducer, and this is a manual of seduction. This is how you take over a realm without firing a shot. You don't need to be a lion if you're sufficiently foxy. Now, Uh, we go through these reflexive metaphors, and then we find out what the point of the rhetoric is. This is the telos, or purpose of rhetoric. The seducer needs plausible deniability through ambiguity. This will be page 267. Well, if he wants to speak or write, continued the Magnifico, he should do so with such modesty and care that to start with, his words should seem wholly tentative and even ambiguous, and affect her in such a way that she may legitimately pretend, if she wished to avoid embarrassment, not to understand what is meant. Thus, if he finds difficulties in his way, he can withdraw easily and pretend to have spoken or written with some other purpose in view. Keep this in mind. This is a work of genius. Next section. Not only is the courtier the epitome of discretion, but he is careful with his words, because that is necessary for a seducer. So if, however, it's at page 259, if, however, he proves to be discreet, using modest phrases and hinting delicately at his love for her in the suave way that I imagine the courtier fashioned by these gentlemen would adopt, then she will pretend not to understand and to take words to mean something else, trying all the time very modestly and with the wit and prudence we have already said she should have to change the subject. Now, this is 257 and 8. The courtier is careful with his words, because seducers have to be. To win the favors of women, every gentleman and knight makes good use of the noble recreations, fine clothes and elegant manners we were talking about, and so he rightly chooses his words for the very same purpose, not only when he is moved to passion, but also very often in order to honor the woman to whom he is speaking. As for responding or not, I think she must make up her own mind and not be influenced by anybody else's wishes. He's setting up the seduction. And he admits, this is page 254, despite all appearances, men are wily seducers, and seduced women are not blameworthy. Where he says, there's been no lack of clever writers to compose books in which they have applied their talents to teaching the ways a woman is to be seduced. This is a reference to Ovid's Art of Love. Everyone who knows Latin literature will be familiar with this. That's the book he's referring to. So what he's saying is, I have an updated manual of seduction that is better, because this is a hidden manual of seduction. Now, here comes the reflexivity again. This book is talking about itself. So he's going to repeat again and again and again that a good courtier, particularly a seductive courtier, must be very, very careful never to traduce the honor of the woman he is seducing, because their honor and their reputation is everything to them. So page 187. Never impugn a lady's honor, since in this respect women are to be counted among the defenseless, and so do not deserve such treatment, having no weapons with which to defend themselves. A little bit later on, page 195. They, women, may impugn a man's virtue more freely than he may insult theirs. And this is because we ourselves, as men, have made it a rule that a dissolute way of life is not thought to be evil or blameworthy or disgraceful, whereas in women, it leads to such complete opprobrium and shame that once a woman has been ill spoken of, whether the accusation is true or false, she is utterly disgraced forever. Thus, since even to mention a woman's honor carries some risk of doing great harm, I say that we should refrain from this and get at them in some other way. So what he's doing here is showing that the seducer must not only show himself to be reliable and quiet, he must repeat that again and again and again to the would-be seduced woman. So again, on 198, the emotions of love provide an excuse for every kind of fault. And even if the betrayal, even of an enemy, can properly held to be a base and hateful crime, consider how much worse a crime is the betrayal of someone we love. You can't tell. Kissing and telling is no good. And he repeats it again and again. This is 201. It is fitting for the courtier to have the greatest reverence for women, and no man of discretion and courtesy should ever assail them for lack of chastity, either in jest or in earnest. And in case the reader or the woman that's being seduced hasn't figured things out yet, he says again on 242, also consider it chivalrous and gentlemanly to conceal the fault, which a woman may have committed either through mischance or excessive love. Moreover, on page 245, he really gets down to brass tacks. Any man who claims to have seduced a woman should be tortured to death, whether the claim is true or not. People of that sort who make a vile boast, whether true or not, of having enjoyed some lady's favors, deserve the severest punishment, even torture, for they are telling lies. For if they are telling lies, what could be more wicked than to employ deceit in robbing a respectable woman of something she values more than her life? Then, if they are telling the truth, what punishment is harsh enough for a man who repays with such rank ingratitude? A lady won over by false flattery has allowed herself to fall too deeply in love, and has foolishly abandoned herself to the mercies of such a malignant creature. No kiss and tell. So that's phase one. This is the process of seduction. Phase two, the seductive courtier sympathizes with the Duchess's plight. Page 253. Alas, the poor Duchess is lonely. And now I must say a word about our Duchess, who has lived with her husband for 15 years like a widow. And those who resist the assaults of love are truly admirable, and those who are sometimes overcome deserve all our compassion. Next to 261, where he justifies adultery. I think you are imposing excessively hard rules on married women, for there are many to be found whose husbands hate them for no reason at all and do them great injury. And when that happens, why do you not want a woman to be allowed to give to others what her husband not only despises, but detests? If women in other circumstances do not respond to those who love them, they are doing an injury to themselves. The Duchess, it turns out, has lovers. Page 264. If my court lady fails to win the love of those whose intentions are impure, this does not mean she will lack for lovers, for she will find many of them who are inspired both by her merits and their own worthiness, which will assure them that they deserve their affection. Now, let me tell you what the punchline is to the stupid joke at the beginning. There is a mimesis here, a representation of the courtly love that existed between Castiglione and the Duchess. All right, it's beautiful. It's a lovely word game that's reserved for the lovers themselves. And this is a remarkable section of the book. This is page 270. I have sometimes heard between two lovers a long and open conversation of love, which those present failed to understand at all, clearly, or to realize was at all amorous. And it was because of this discretion and wariness of the lovers, for without showing any displeasure at being overheard, they whispered the only words that mattered and spoke aloud that could have been interpreted in various other ways. Now, notice the beginning of this. I have sometimes heard between two lovers a long and open conversation of love. Well, if this long and open conversation of love is only understood by the lovers, and Castiglione has heard it, Castiglione has to be one of the lovers. He is tipping his hand. This is what shows that Castiglione has actually practiced these activities of seduction. Now, the only problem we're left to figure out is who's the other half?